This is lecture titled Methods and Measurement, 2017-07-12. Section 1 of Methods and Measurement lecture called Scientific Method. In this section, we'll describe the purpose of the scientific method, distinguish between qualitative and quantitative observations, describe the difference between hypothesis, theories, and models. Let's start with hypothesis. Hypothesis is an explanation that is based upon a prior scientific research or observation that can be tested experimentally. In other words, a scientist or a person looks at things that happen in the natural world or in the lab and tries to come up with an explanation as to why it happens. In other words, what causes it to happen. And they formulate this as a hypothesis. If this happens, then that happens. A hypothesis is usually an if-then statement that you can test in an experiment. A model. In science, it's more than just a physical model. It could be a physical model, but it's often more than a physical model. It's an explanation of how phenomena occur and how the data or events are related. A model could actually be part of a theory. So it could be a physical model like the model of an airplane if you're testing aerodynamics for Boeing airplanes, or it could be an idea, a conceptual type model like the atomic model. Right? A theory is a plausible explanation of a body of observed natural phenomena. Scientific method. Scientific method is an approach to problem solving. And it typically starts with observing and collecting data. You analyze the data and you try to figure out why. Why does this happen? What causes what? That's the formation of hypothesis, the second step. Then you just can't take that hypothesis to be true. You test hypothesis using experiments. And then once you get the results from your experiments that test the hypothesis, you formulate theories that explain what happens and why it happens, and those theories have to be supported by the data. This is what makes science different than a lot of other human endeavors, that it has to be supported by the data. And then in the process of doing all these things, scientists always communicate to their peers and to the world what they found. And the peers in the world get to judge that and say whether they think it's true or not true. And so scientists are held to a pretty strict requirement of being able to prove what they say is true. Okay, observing and collecting data. Observing is the use of our senses to obtain information. Data can be qualitative or descriptive, or it can be quantitative. A qualitative description might be, the chemical is white. A quantitative description is that the chemical weighs 18.6 grams. Anything that with a number in it is a numerical or quantitative description. Okay, formulating hypothesis. Scientists make generalizations based upon the data, and they use these generalizations to formulate hypothesis or testable statements. As previously stated, hypothesis is often an if-then statement. Hypothesis is an explanation based on prior scientific research or observation that can be tested experimentally. In other words, it's why something's happening or what causes what. All right, now take a look at this data that a scientist collects. Let's see if we can formulate your own hypothesis. The data has time listed on the x-axis, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 days, and the growth of these plants on the y-axis, 0, 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters, and so forth. Now each of these lines represents this is where I want you to try and figure out what each of these lines represents. And notice each line has a label on it. The red line has a label of 50% fertilizer, the blue 25, the teal 10, and the yellow or orange no fertilizer. All right, now pause the tape now while you try and figure out what the hypothesis might be from this data. And when you come back, I'll tell you the answer. Okay, the scientist who set up this experiment is measuring plant growth over time with 4 different plants based upon fertilizer. The orange line is no fertilizer, then 10, then 20, then 25% fertilizer. So the hypothesis that they might come away from with this data is that the different amounts of fertilizer produce different rates of growth. In particular, the more fertilizer they use, the greater their growth, but up to a point. Look at the difference between the 25 and the 50. There's very little difference between 25 and 50%. So if you were a farmer and 25% fertilizer cost you $10 per bag and the 50% fertilizer cost you 20, would you use it? Well, it'd probably be a waste because you wouldn't get that much of a difference in your growth. Okay, another hypothesis. A couple of scientists at MIT, one of these guys was a student. Their names are down here. James was a student and Michael S. Stefano was the professor. They had an idea that they got from biology by observing how penguins swim by flapping their flippers. And they hypothesized that if you could design a boat that would move in the same way that a penguin does, that it would be much more efficient than the normal propeller boats like you see here in the first picture. So they built a boat called Proteus, and they tested their hypothesis. And indeed they found that the boat built with the propellers had a greater efficiency, like up to 85% or more, compared to less than 80% on the traditional boat. There's some links to the articles, and there's a PDF also I have of the article from MIT News. The hypothesis being that if you could design a boat with propellers similar to, or flappers similar to the Penguin, it would be much more efficient than a traditional propeller boat. Now, these pictures I got, the one on the right from the MIT website and the other one for searching Google, their references are listed below. I want you to take a look at this in terms of how good these pictures illustrate the concept or hypothesis the scientists came across. Well, what would you say different if you were making a revised, better version of this experiment or this PowerPoint? I mean, this boat isn't the actual boat that they compared it to. Pause. Okay, if you said that the two boats are very different and it's hard to measure the efficiency by using two different boats, you'd be correct. And that illustrates a very important concept in science. Remember, this first boat is not the actual experimental boat. It's a picture selected for this PowerPoint. If I were to select a better picture or design a better experiment, it would be the same shape boat. The two boats would look the same. They'd have the same for the propeller part. They'd have the same mass. They'd have the same distribution of weight, same keel line and all that. Everything would be the same. You call those the controls. In experiments, it's important that you control everything except for the one or two things that you're studying here. And the two things that you're studying in this experiment is the kinds of propellers, so those would be different, and the efficiency of the boats, which you'll measure that. Okay, testing hypothesis. Testing hypothesis requires experimentation that provides data to support or refute the hypothesis, and controls are the experimental conditions that remain constant. Variables are those things that you change in the experiment to see ultimately what causes what, how things happen. Okay, theorizing. A model in science is more than just a physical object. It is often an explanation of how phenomena occur and how data or events are related. A model can be visual, verbal, or even mathematical in nature. An example would be the atomic model of matter, which we're going to study in this course. A theory is a broad generalization that explains a body of facts or phenomenon. Example, the atomic theory. All right, the scientific method. Here's one way to illustrate the scientific method. We've been getting at this during the entire lecture. It starts with observing data, collecting, measuring that data, formulating an hypothesis, trying to explain why it's happening, what's causing what, making a prediction, then testing that hypothesis with experimentation, then building a theory based upon that explains what's happening. And a theory is based on the data. Hypothesis is based on observing and guessing what's causing what, but the theory is based on the final analysis of the data that you've proven what causes what. Then you would publish our results. Notice communication is a part of all of these processes. That during this process, we communicate to our peers and our other experimenters and our lab group members as to what's going on, and that process of communication helps refine the process. So when you're doing a hypothesis, you evaluate it, and you make changes in the hypothesis based upon your testing and your experimentation. And when you publish results, you get feedback from your peers. So this is a constantly evolving process. All right, summary. Scientific method is a logical approach to solving problems. It involves observing, formulating a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, formulating theories, and communicating. Hypothesis is an example that is based on prior scientific research or observation that can be tested experimentally. A model is more than a physical model. It's an explanation of how phenomena occur and how data or events are related. And a model could be part of a theory. And a theory is a plausible explanation of a body of observed natural phenomenon. Now, data can be qualitative or quantitative. All right, that ends this section 1.